The assignment went to the 23D Special Troops, a deception unit equipped with such devices as sonic gear to simulate heavy motor traffic and inflatable rubber tanks. Assuming the guise of the 75th Infantry Division, which was actually en route from England to the continent, the men of the detachment wore the division's shoulder patch and marked their vehicles as if they belonged to the 75th Division. Radio traffic simulating a division headquarters and supporting units went out intentionally in an easily broken code. Proceeding for 5 days, the so-called rubber duck operation showed up on German situation maps for a while as a question mark, but by December 15th, von Rundstedt's headquarters had decided that no new division existed, and the question mark disappeared. The only ones genuinely fooled were the Americans, for at headquarters of the E8 Corps, they read reports from the front of increased enemy radio and vehicular traffic as a response to the deception operation, and some troops of the 4th Infantry Division in the line in Luxembourg were later to wonder why the 75th Division never came forward to help them. Middleton nevertheless still nursed a considerable concern. To the commander of the 9th Army, Lieutenant General William H. Simpson, who stopped by Bastogne on December 5th after a conference with General Bradley in Luxembourg City, he confided in strong terms that he was convinced the Germans had altered their practice on his front. Whereas previously the Germans had been unloading troops in the rear area, bringing some up to the front line and then moving them to other sectors, he thought at that point that they were pretending to do the same thing, but were actually building up a large force in the rear area. To subordinates at least, Middleton displayed no such concern, as exemplified on December 10th, when he heard from the commander of the 2D Infantry Division, Major General Walter M. Robertson, who at the time was responsible for that part of the front, which included the Schnee Eifel. On the 8th and the 9th, the 2D Division's outposts had reported intense enemy activity, including heavy motor traffic. By the 10th, the activity had slackened, leading Robertson's G2, Lieutenant Colonel Donald P. Christensen, to conclude that one unit had replaced another in the line and that the relief is now complete. Yet Robertson was still worried, not necessarily about any broad German plan, but about his own front, for the troops on the Schnee Eifel might be trapped by German drives around both ends of the ridge. That night, as he talked in his office in St. Vith with his chief of staff, he telephoned Middleton, who declined a request for aerial reconnaissance the next day. "Go back to sleep, Robbie," he said. "You have been having a bad dream." The Corps commander, whose responsibility included the northern portion of the Ardennes, Major General Leonard T. Gero of the 5th Corps, was preoccupied throughout much of November with an attack in the Hurtgen forest, and later as the date for the enemy's offensive approached with the attack to take the Roa River dams. Gero's G2, Colonel Thomas J. Ford, noted that prisoners were reporting the presence of SS troops in towns close to the front, but he presumed they were possibly surveying the new Roa River defense line. The 2D Division's G2, Colonel Christensen, whose division was to be relieved in the Schnee Eifel sector to carry the main weight of the attack for the dams, was more concerned. He expected the Germans to react to the American attack with local counterattacks, but also envisaged the possibility of a major counterattack just south of the dams. Christensen had in mind a counterattack with 2 panzer divisions, for it seemed probable that 2 were located several miles east of the dams. Considering Gero's own strength in that sector, 3 infantry divisions, a combat command of armour, and a cavalry reconnaissance squadron, the possibility of a counterattack by 2 panzer divisions was hardly to be taken lightly. Such a counterattack, Gero believed, posed the greatest threat to his south wing, where one of his divisions was spread thin along a 20-mile front southeastward from Monschau to the Losheim Gap, and where the attacking 2D Division would be depending for support of its attack upon a single road running through a dense forest close behind the front. That prompted Gero to designate a fallback position in that sector should it be required. He chose a stretch of high ground that would come to be known as the Elsen Bourne. In the mineral resort town of Spa, at the 1st Army headquarters in the Grand Hotel Britannique, which 26 years before had served the same purpose for von Hindenburg and Ludendorff Monk-Dixon, his trip to Paris again delayed by General Thorson's failure to return because of bad flying weather, was becoming not only concerned but agitated. He learned on the 14th that many PWs were saying an offensive was soon to begin, probably between the 17th and 25th of December, while others spoke of the recapture of Aachen as a Christmas present for the Führer. There were further reports of heavy reinforcements pouring toward the front in the general area between Dieren and Trier, which encompassed the entire Eifel. That night, during a staff meeting held in General Hodges' office, it had once been von Hindenburg's. Dixon suddenly slapped the situation map in the area between Monschau and Echternach. "It's the Ardennes," he exclaimed. Yet Courtney Hodges and Dixon's compatriots on the First Army staff knew Monk Dixon as an impetuous man. In September, he had burst into Hodges' sleeping van with a monitored radio report saying von Rundstedt had ordered army troops to disarm the SS and appealed to the German people to join him in obtaining an honorable peace, which, when checked, turned out to be an American black propaganda broadcast designed to confuse the German people. Indeed, a basic reason for the conflict within the staff was the G3 section's failure, except on rare occasions, to listen to Dixon. On the night of December 14th, nobody paid much attention to his outburst. As evidenced by Dixon's next G2 periodic report, issued the following morning, he himself saw no reason to put his impetuosity on record. The enemy, he assumed, was resorting to his attack propaganda to bolster morale of the troops, although he cautioned it was possible that a limited-scale offensive will be launched for the purpose of achieving a Christmas morale victory for civilian consumption. As for the Ardennes, he remarked only that the 8th Corps had reported that an abrupt change of routine of enemy personnel opposite 9th Armoured Division strongly suggests that new troops may have arrived in that area, to which he or a subordinate commented, very likely a recently arrived Volksgrenadier Division, coming in to relieve 212 Volksgrenadier Division. With that, Dixon finally set off for his 4-day leave in Paris. Before he went, he may have seen the message that arrived in the headquarters from the 8th Corps shortly before midnight on the 14th. It told of a German woman who had come through the lines and spoken of seeing many horse-drawn vehicles, pontoons, small boats, and other river-crossing equipment, as well as many artillery pieces, both horse-drawn and carried on trucks, in the vicinity of Bitburg. The observations were not those of a German woman, but of Elise Dell. Reproducing the report for transmission to subordinate commands, somebody added the comment, "A very interesting report. Build-up of troops has been confirmed by TAC-R and PW statements. However, presence of large numbers of engineers with bridging equipment suggests preparation for offensive rather than defensive action." Word went out to the 28th Division to investigate with ground patrols. As Monk Dixon left for Paris, all the other senior intelligence officers were at their posts. None expressed any new concern for the Ardennes, although one whose remarks had gone unnoticed by the others, Lieutenant Colonel Anthony Tasker, a British officer serving as G2 of the 1st Allied Airborne Army, had for 2 weeks been pointing toward the Ardennes as a likely spot for the anticipated German strike. Making his predictions at daily headquarters briefings, he pointed particularly to the thinly held sector on and near the Schnee Eifel. Yet headquarters of the 1st Allied Airborne Army was out of the line in England, and not being engaged in operations was publishing no intelligence estimates, and since Tasker had no intelligence input that the other commands lacked, who would have paid any attention anyway? There was clearly no concern at headquarters of the 21st Army Group. Field Marshal Montgomery's Chief of Staff, Major General Francis de Guingand, was on leave in England, and Montgomery himself had written General Eisenhower for permission to spend Christmas in London with his son. In Luxembourg City, General Bradley was getting ready to depart on the morning of the 16th for Versailles, where he was to participate in a conference at SHAEF's main headquarters on a critical shortage of American infantry replacements. In Spa, the First Army's commander, General Hodges, during the afternoon, had received a visiting galaxy of professional baseball players, including Frankie Frisch, Bucky Walters, Dutch Leonard, and Mel Ott, and had then conferred for an hour with the commander of the 8th Corps, General Middleton. Since he had a bad head cold, he retired early in his requisitioned villa, Le Boqueteau, atop a ridge 2 miles outside Spa in a community of expensive villas known as Balmoral. After returning from Spa to Bastogne, General Middleton also went off early to his sleeping van. At Versailles on the 15th, an Allied Air Commanders Conference heard Eisenhower's G3, Major General Harold R. Bull, report that the first arms attack on the Roa River dams had failed to provoke a reaction from the enemy's Panzer Reserve, and that on the 8-Corps front there was nothing to report. Eisenhower's Air Intelligence Officer, Air Commodore C.M. Grierson, then rose to relate that the Luftwaffe had continued to move fighter aircraft westward, but that the shifts were defensive only. At Bletchley Park, somebody put into the file a flimsy deciphered and sent to headquarters on the continent on December 12th, Jaj Corps II, aware 11 hours 10th that all SS units were observing wireless silence. Colonel Dixon at headquarters of the First Army had come closer than anybody to predicting what was about to happen in the Ardennes. Yet despite his brief impetuous outburst, It's the Ardennes-Dixon too represented part of a general intelligence failure. Yet Ultra and many another intelligence source had provided a lot of information that, properly interpreted and mixed with other material, should have told Eisenhower, Bradley, Hodges, Middleton, and Gero what was about to hit them. What Ultra had failed to do was to be specific, to say exactly why Hitler was shifting fighter aircraft westward and building a large reserve with Panzer and SS Panzer divisions as its core. Allied commanders had come to expect Ultra to be specific, to tell them not only what, but when and where. When neither Ultra nor their other intelligence sources told them those things, they failed to penetrate Hitler's masterful deception scheme to parade the assembly of the 6th Panzer Army in the north, while preparing secretly to attack in the Ardennes. Only toward the end had Strong, Seibert, and Dixon, with some help from Koch of the Third Army, begun to pay attention to the Ardennes, to become aware of the move of enemy units into the Eifel. Yet even then, they expressed no conviction, with the exception of Dixon's outburst, that the Germans intended a major blow in the Ardennes. It would represent, as Walter Bedell Smith was to remark later, a dying gasp. No goddamned fool would do it. In no way did the intelligence officers alert their commanders to a threat in the Ardennes serious enough or imminent enough to warrant any change in Eisenhower's offensive plans north and south of the region. To skitter and react with nervous defensive moves to every possibility open to the enemy is tantamount to surrendering all initiative. The fact was that throughout the autumn and up to the last, almost all the intelligence specialists were assessing German intentions with three propositions in mind. First, that von Rundstedt, a capable old soldier, was in full charge on the Western Front. Had not the sturdy German defence all through the fall reflected the steady hand of an experienced commander acting according to time-tested and long-accepted tactics and principles? That gave verisimilitude to the theory, which even a doubting Oskar Koch finally accepted, that the German armour would be used sanely and rationally to counterattack the impending Allied drive toward the Rhine and the Ruhr. Second, so hard-pressed was von Rundstedt, both north and south of the Ardennes, partly as a result of having pulled divisions from the line to form a reserve, that he was finally having to shift divisions in either direction to counter upcoming American offensives. That accounted for the rail and motor traffic in the Eifel. Third, as General Seibert reported on December 12th, German losses had been so great that the front was more brittle and more vulnerable than it appeared to be, and the enemy, as Brigadier Williams so forcibly noted, was in no condition to mount a major offensive. A general belief that the Germans were desperately short of fuel for tanks and planes fed that assumption. One intercepted message after another told of crippling fuel shortages. Who could have guessed that those messages told in fact of a desperate effort to accumulate enough fuel to launch a major offensive? The enemy could still do something, the feeling was, but not much. The basic failure was to have neglected to look beyond Gerd von Rundstedt to Adolf Hitler, and to have recognized the desperation that motivated the Führer. The great German military theorist Karl von Clausewitz, in his famous treatise on war, written while he headed the Kriegsakademie early in the 19th century, had spelled it out: when the disproportion of power is so great that no limitation of our own object can ensure us safety from a catastrophe, or where the probable duration of the danger is such that the greatest economy of forces can no longer bring us to our object, then the forces will, or should, be concentrated in one desperate blow. He who is hard-pressed will regard the greatest daring as the greatest wisdom at most, perhaps employing the assistance of subtle stratagem. Allied intelligence officers had committed the most grievous sin of which a G2 is capable. They had looked in a mirror for the enemy and seen there only the reflection of their own intentions. The heavy drain of the Long War had forced the German army early in 1944 to reduce the strength of its infantry division from just over 17,000 men to just under 13,000, and to cut one of the battalions from each of 3 infantry regiments, although a so-called Fusilier battalion under division control was normally employed like a 7th Infantry Battalion. At slightly over 14,000 men, the American division had 1,000 more men and 9 infantry battalions. To make up, in part, for the cuts, the Germans vastly increased individual automatic weapons, especially a machine pistol known as the Schmeisser, whose high cyclic rate of fire made a kind of emetic or burp sound, so that the American soldier called it a burp gun. In most other aspects of armament, the 2 divisions were roughly similar. The individual American rifle, the M1, was semi-automatic, that of the German, a bolt-action piece. Light air-cooled machine guns were comparable, except that the German piece had a much higher cyclic rate of fire, which produced such rapid fire that the German soldier called it the Hitler Sage. The Americans had a heavy water-cooled machine gun dating from World War I, which the Germans had abandoned. The Americans also had another weapon dating from the Great War, the Browning automatic rifle, called the Bar. Basic mortars were similar, the American, a 60 mm, and an 81 mm, but on the American side, there were limited numbers of a much more powerful weapon, the 4.2-inch chemical mortar, designed for firing chemical shells, but effective with high explosive and white phosphorus. Both sides had individual anti-tank rockets employing a shaped charge, the Germans a one-shot Panzerfaust, and the Americans a bazooka, named for a makeshift musical instrument played by a hillbilly radio comedian, Bob Burns. The crew-served American anti-tank weapon, a towed 57 mm piece, was little better than a pea-shooter against German tanks, while the German division had 18 self-propelled 75 mm assault guns, normally used as close support for attacking infantry, but effective against tanks. As a kind of assault gun, each American infantry regiment had 6 towed short-barreled 105 mm howitzers in a cannon company. Both divisions had 3 medium artillery battalions and 1 heavy battalion for a total of 48 howitzers. To provide increased direct fire support for the infantry and better anti-tank defense, it had become standard practice by the fall of 1944 to attach to each American infantry division a tank battalion and a tank destroyer battalion. The tank battalion had a company of lights and 3 companies of mediums, and some recently arrived battalions had an assault gun platoon with 6 tanks equipped with a 105 mm howitzer. The tank destroyer battalion had either a towed 3-inch gun or a 76 mm or 90 mm self-propelled gun. Those attachments made the American infantry division considerably stronger in men and firepower than the German Volksgrenadier division, and at least the equal of the German Panzergrenadier division, which had organic medium tank and tank destroyer battalions and a contingent of half-tracks for transporting its grenadiers. Since the American division had a wealth of motor vehicles, plus the attached tanks and tank destroyers, it was as mobile as the Panzergrenadier division. Neither the Panzergrenadier nor the parachute division had had to take the sharp reductions imposed on the Volksgrenadiers, so that both types of divisions still had 9 battalions of infantry. The parachute divisions were considered to be elite, and in months long past they had been made up almost entirely of volunteers. But after heavy losses in an airborne assault on Crete in 1941, Hitler had become disenchanted with airborne troops. Airborne training virtually ceased, and among the parachute infantry in the Ardennes, few had any parachute training. The name Parachute Division had become nothing more than an honorific. The German Panzer and SS Panzer Division had a panzer regiment with 2 tank battalions and a self-propelled tank destroyer battalion. Most of the divisions in the Ardennes had around 130 tanks and tank destroyers combined. The Panzer Grenadiers of both types of divisions, 4 battalions in the Army Division, 6 in the SS Division, were supposed to ride in half-tracks. Only 1 of 3 artillery battalions in the Army Division and 1 of 4 in the SS Division was self-propelled. The Army Division had 13,000 men, the SS Division 20,000, and all the SS divisions were beefed up with an attached tank or tank destroyer battalion, a Nebelwerfer rocket battalion, and a heavy 170 mm artillery battery. Most American armored divisions had 3 tank battalions equipped with a total of 177 medium tanks, a self-propelled tank destroyer battalion, 3 medium artillery battalions, and 3 battalions of armoured infantry, one of the war's great misnomers. For when battle was joined, the armoured infantryman fought outside his half-track with no more protection than any other foot soldier. 2 divisions, the 2D and 3D armoured, were different, having been organised under an earlier table of organisation with more tanks but fewer infantry than the other armoured divisions. Both sides had general support artillery, plus such specialised units as signal, quartermaster, ordnance, engineers and the like. But in those specialised units, the Germans were at a dual disadvantage in numbers and quality. Such a basic item as tank recovery vehicles, for example, was in critically short supply, and several engineer battalions had never erected a bridge before. The American units, on the other hand, were at full strength, thoroughly trained and experienced in the field. American engineer battalions, trained in addition to their engineer duties to fight as infantry, were to prove to be a hidden reserve. The one major German advantage was the quality of German tanks vis-à-vis those of the Americans. The Americans still had 77 light tanks in their armoured divisions and still used the light tank as a basic weapon in cavalry reconnaissance units, but its armour was absurdly thin and its 37 mm piece of no value except for firing canister against enemy infantry. The standard American tank was the 33-ton Sherman, most still equipped with a short-barreled 75 mm gun, although some had an improved long-barreled 76 mm high-velocity piece. By December 1944, the Sherman would have to be considered almost obsolescent, its only advantage over German tanks being a greater rapidity of fire as a result of a gyro stabilizer and power traverse and somewhat greater mobility. Like German tanks, it used regular gasoline rather than diesel and was thus readily put to the torch. Some crewmen called it, after a popular cigarette lighter, the Ronson. No American heavy tank had yet reached the battlefield. The workhorses of the battlefield for the Panzer and SS Panzer divisions were medium tanks, the 27-ton Mark IV, a mainstay for the entire war, which mounted a long-barreled 75 mm gun, and the 47-ton Mark V Panther, which also mounted a 75 mm gun, but had much thicker armour than either the Mark IV or the Sherman. Although the Sherman fought on equal terms with the Mark IV, it could knock out a Panther only with a shot to the side or rear. The Germans also had behemoths, a 63-ton Mark VI Tiger and a 68-ton Royal or King Tiger, both of which were heavily armoured and mounted a deadly high-velocity 88 mm gun. Although reports from American soldiers would indicate that the Tiger was omnipresent, only about 150 of them were to fight in the Ardennes, employed in separate battalions, usually attached to a Panzer or SS Panzer division. The only American weapon that could consistently be counted upon to knock out a Tiger was the tank destroyer equipped with a 90 mm gun, which had been developed originally as an anti-aircraft weapon. A Tiger advancing with machine guns blazing or 88 blasting was a near paralyzing sight. The Ardennes was at once the nursery and the old folks' home of the American command. New divisions came there for a battlefield shakedown, old ones to rest after heavy fighting and absorb replacements for their losses. In the north, covering Monschau, was the 102D Cavalry Group, a light force equipped with armoured cars, light tanks, and a few self-propelled 75 mm assault guns. From Monschau southeast to the Losheim Gap and the boundary with the 8th Corps, the 99th Infantry Division, which had been in the line for 5 weeks but had yet to mount an attack, held a front approximately 20 miles long. Like almost all American divisions arriving in Europe in the fall of 1944, the 99th had been raided for replacements, and shortly before shipping overseas, filled its ranks with men transferred from ground units of the Army Air Forces, from anti-aircraft units, and from the Army Specialized Training Program, the last and ill-starred experiment to provide technical training in colleges and universities for men with high IQs. For long, only a cavalry reconnaissance squadron had held the 5-mile width of the Losheim Gap. After repeated requests for reinforcement from the commander of the 2D Division, General Robertson, to whom the cavalry was attached, headquarters of the 14th Cavalry Group had arrived on December 11th to assume control of that squadron, and brought with it a second squadron. That such a small force was entrusted with defending the critical Losheim Gap demonstrated the complacency with which American commanders viewed the possibility of a German offensive in the Ardennes. Yet other commanders on the ground were concerned. The 99th Division protected its right flank next to the gap with its only reserve infantry battalion, and the 2D Division placed one of its 2 reserve infantry battalions on its left flank close to the gap. The only other deference to the gap as a historic débouché was provided by the commander of the 8th Corps, General Middleton, who placed 8 of his 13 Corps artillery battalions in positions from which they could fire either into the Losheim Gap and/or in the sector around the Schnee Eifel. Since early October, the 2D Division had held an 18-mile front that included the Schnee Eifel and extended southwest beyond the ridge almost to the Luxembourg border. To free the 2D Division for the First Army's attack on the Roa River dams, the 106th Infantry Division, fresh off the boats and flush with new men, mostly from the ASTP, began taking over on December 10th. In late November, the veteran 28th Infantry Division, having lost 5,000 men in bloody fighting in the Hurtgen Forest, replaced another division that had been resting in the Ardennes, taking over a 25-mile front along the Our River all the way south to the juncture of the Our and the Schur. In effect, the 28th held nothing more than an outpost line. With the arrival of the 9th Armoured Division in late October as a reserve for the 8th Corps, General Middleton, in order to provide the men with some battle experience, used the Armoured Infantry Battalion from one of the 3 combat commands to hold just over 2 miles of the 28th Division's front, intending to rotate the battalion with others. The tanks of that battalion's combat command were kept in reserve a few miles to the rear. Although the 9th Armoured Division's other 2 combat commands were in reserve farther to the rear, one began to move on December 13th to provide an armoured reserve for the attack to take the Roa River dams. On December 7th, the veteran 4th Infantry Division, having incurred almost as many casualties in the Hurtgen Forest as the 28th Division, took over the rest of the line some 20 miles from the vicinity of Echternach to the boundary with the 3rd Army southeast of Luxembourg City. Since the southern boundary of the German offensive was to be a few miles south of Echternach, only a portion of the 4th Division was destined to become involved in the fighting. In addition to the 13 General Support Artillery battalions of the 8th Corps, General Gero of the 5th Corps had just over 6 battalions concentrated near his southern boundary to support the attack on the Roa River dams. Thus, there were 228 artillery pieces in addition to the 276 organic to divisions that would be capable of firing at some point within the Ardennes. It was an impressive assembly, yet far fewer than those available to the attacker. Middleton also was to have the support of an engineer combat group of 4 battalions and another of 3 battalions operating in rear areas of the 8th Corps, under control of headquarters of the 1st Army. In the entire D8 Corps, there were 182 self-propelled tank destroyers and 242 medium tanks. They would be considerably outnumbered. The men who manned the foxholes in the Ardennes knew that in comparison to attacking, they had it good. When not in their holes, they had warm, dry places to sleep in, houses, cellars, or bunker-type squad huts made from logs of the big fir trees, covered with sandbags. Some had heating from stoves mostly taken from nearby villages. Except in the most exposed positions, the troops almost always had hot food, and they could attend religious services back at battalion or regimental headquarters. From time to time, a man got to go on a 48-hour pass to regimental or divisional rest camps well to the rear, where he could take a shower, sleep on a cot, buy a watered beer, have coffee and donuts dispensed by smiling American girls in Red Cross uniforms, see a movie, or on rare occasions, a USO show, and even more rarely, find a whorehouse where you had to stand in line. But what the hell? There was nevertheless a war on. The Germans, shelled with mortars and artillery, got nervous when a new division moved in and sent combat patrols to find out what was going on. The battalion S2 was forever demanding that companies send out patrols to nab a prisoner, to determine what the enemy was up to, and to cover the great gaps in the line, sometimes up to a mile or more between units. Contact patrols had to operate on a fairly regular basis. So porous was the line that German soldiers whose homes were in the eastern corner of Belgium sometimes slipped through to spend a night with their wives or girlfriends in St. Vith or nearby villages, and German agents mingled with the GI patrons of bars and cafés in the bigger towns. On occasion, a German patrol might hit an installation in the rear of the line, a battalion headquarters or a supply point, lay mines on roads, or sometimes string a strand of heavy wire across a road within American lines so that the driver of a fast-moving jeep with windshield down might be decapitated. On one occasion, a German patrol ambushed 3 medical officers, a lieutenant colonel and 2 majors killed them and stripped them of their uniforms. A few days later, in the reserve positions of the 9th Armoured Division's Combat Command B, as 3 officers were going to their mess hall, they passed 3 medics, a lieutenant colonel and 2 majors, who were escorting 3 women wearing nylons and heavily veiled. The 2 parties exchanged salutes, but as the armoured officers sat down to their meal, almost as one they did a double take. What was it about those medical officers? They had red crosses on their helmets and on the brassards on their arms, but something was wrong. No American medic ever carried a weapon, yet all 3 had .45 caliber pistols strapped to their waists. And nylons. What woman in wartime Luxembourg had nylons? The 3 officers dashed outside, their weapons at the ready, but they were too late. Nobody was to be seen. As Nulltag finally approached, senior German commanders had no more faith in the Führer's grand design than when they had first heard of it. Individually, without consulting one another, neither von Rundstedt, Model, nor von Manteuffel made any plans for operations beyond the Meuse. Although von Manteuffel, at least, hoped to gain bridgeheads over the river just in case Hitler had more forces hidden up his sleeve, he was convinced that that was the only way the offensive might continue toward Antwerp, for if by some strange good fortune the German armies should reach the Meuse without encountering strong enemy forces, those forces would surely be lying in wait on the other side of the river. Nor did Sepp Dietrich display any greater optimism. In conjunction with his chief of staff, Brigadeführer der Waffen-SS Fritz Kramer, a general staff-trained officer for whom von Rundstedt and Model had arranged appointment in order to afford the 6th Panzer Army professional tactical and strategic direction, Dietrich had drawn up a plan, with the tacit consent of von Rundstedt and Model, but without the knowledge either of General Jodl or Hitler, to alter the Führer's dictate. Instead of passing south of Liège and crossing the Meuse west of the city, the 6th Panzer Army was to cross on both sides of the city. That would put Dietrich in position to implement the small solution, should it come to that. Hitler for some reason became suspicious, for on the eve of the offensive, after nightfall on December 15th, he telephoned Model. There will be no deviation by the panzer units east of the Meuse toward the north, he admonished. The 6th Panzer Army must keep clear of the covering front to be built up between Monschau and Liège. Do not let Dietrich become involved in the fighting along his northern flank, to which Model replied, Jawohl, mein Führer, and shortly telephoned back to say he had given the instructions to Dietrich. All the efforts of Army Group B, said Model, will be directed toward the thrust to Antwerp. As for the other army commander, General Brandenberger, whose 7th Army was to secure the southern flank of the penetration, there was no way he could be optimistic. To attack, and then to defend more than 80 miles of up and down Ardennes countryside from Echternach to the Meuse River at Givet, he would have only 4 infantry divisions, no tanks, and a mere handful of tank destroyers and assault guns. An earlier hope of taking Luxembourg City had to be abandoned, but even with that modification, Brandenburger's appeared to be an impossible assignment. Despite the presence to the south of the 3rd US Army and its commander George Patton, for whom German generals had immense respect, Hitler showed less concern about the south flank than about the north. Enlarging on an idea originally suggested by Model Hitler on December 8th, suddenly developed a new interest in parachute troops. He wanted a battalion of just over 1,000 paratroopers to drop behind Monschau astride the only north-south road leading across the moors of the Hautes-Fagnes, there to block American reinforcements from the north until Dietrich's troops could arrive to erect a solid defensive shoulder. Making the link up was to be the assignment of a special task force equipped with 21 experimental Jagdtigers, 82-ton monsters mounting an awesome 128 mm gun, the mainstay of German anti-aircraft defences, on a Tiger chassis. The airborne attack fell to a veteran paratrooper who had fought on Crete a man of the old Catholic aristocracy called Graf Friedrich August von der Heydter. To assemble the troops, Hitler ordered commanders of all parachute regiments to send 100 of their best soldiers, which predictably set in motion the game long practiced in every army of getting rid of misfits and incompetents. Yet when men of von der Heydter's old unit, the 6th Parachute Regiment, learned of the mission, some 250 of them took off and reported to their former commander, who somehow managed to convince his superiors to allow him to hold on to them. At that point, von der Heydter had only a few days left in which to prepare his ragtag force, few of whom had ever made even a practice parachute jump, and the man to whom von der Heydter was to be responsible, Sepp Dietrich, was less than cooperative. When von der Heydter reported at his headquarters near Münstereifel, Dietrich had been drinking heavily. Since a parachute drop would alert the enemy, declared Dietrich, it would have to be made only a few hours before the ground attack started, which would mean a night drop. Von der Heydter pointed out that to jump at night into a region of forests and moors with such inexperienced troops as he possessed would be suicidal, but Dietrich refused to budge. "Do not worry," Dietrich assured him. The paratroopers would have to hold for only a few hours before the big Jagdtigers reached them. The commander of another special force, Otto Skorzeny, already concerned that the order requesting volunteers for his mission had surely fallen into Allied hands, had encountered little to encourage him in his assignment of penetrating the American line with German soldiers masquerading as Americans. From the first, he was concerned that soldiers wearing the enemy's uniform would be violating international laws of war and subject, if captured, to execution, but legal counsel assured him that the laws permitted wearing enemy uniforms as a ruse de guerre, forbidding only fighting while wearing them. His men could wear their German uniforms underneath and take off the American ones before opening fire. That, Skorzeny knew, was claptrap. Skorzeny also recognized that it would be impossible to create a cohesive brigade, which was the size unit he considered necessary, out of random volunteers in the short time available. Only with difficulty did he persuade Jodl to give him 2 infantry battalions and a company of tanks. Those were to be the core of the 150th Panzer Brigade of 3,300 men. The response to the call for volunteers who spoke American dialect left Skorzeny in dismay. Only 10, mostly former merchant seamen, spoke perfect English with some knowledge of American slang. Another 125 had a fair command of English, and about 200 others had learned a little English in school. Enlarging on an idea originally suggested by Model Hitler on December 8th, suddenly developed a new interest in parachute troops. He wanted a battalion of just over 1,000 paratroopers to drop behind Monschau, astride the only north-south road leading across the moors of the Hautes-Fagnes, there to block American reinforcements from the north until Dietrich's troops could arrive to erect a solid defensive shoulder. Making the link up was to be the assignment of a special task force equipped with 21 experimental Jagdtigers, 82-ton monsters mounting an awesome 128 mm gun, the mainstay of German anti-aircraft defences, on a Tiger chassis. The airborne attack fell to a veteran paratrooper who had fought on Crete, a man of the old Catholic aristocracy, called Graf Friedrich August von der Heydter. To assemble the troops, Hitler ordered commanders of all parachute regiments to send 100 of their best soldiers, which predictably set in motion the game long practiced in every army of getting rid of misfits and incompetents. Yet when men of von der Heydter's old unit, the 6th Parachute Regiment, learned of the mission, some 250 of them took off and reported to their former commander, who somehow managed to convince his superiors to allow him to hold on to them. At that point, von der Heydter had only a few days left in which to prepare his ragtag force, few of whom had ever made even a practice parachute jump, and the man to whom von der Heydter was to be responsible, Sepp Dietrich, was less than cooperative. When von der Heydter reported at his headquarters near Münstereifel, Dietrich had been drinking heavily. Since a parachute drop would alert the enemy, declared Dietrich, it would have to be made only a few hours before the ground attack started, which would mean a night drop. Von der Heydter pointed out that to jump at night into a region of forests and moors with such inexperienced troops as he possessed would be suicidal, but Dietrich refused to budge. "Do not worry," Dietrich assured him. The paratroopers would have to hold for only a few hours before the big Jagdtigers reached them. The commander of another special force, Otto Skorzeny, already concerned that the order requesting volunteers for his mission had surely fallen into Allied hands, had encountered little to encourage him in his assignment of penetrating the American line with German soldiers masquerading as Americans. From the first, he was concerned that soldiers wearing the enemy's uniform would be violating international laws of war and subject, if captured, to execution. But legal counsel assured him that the laws permitted wearing enemy uniforms as a ruse de guerre, forbidding only fighting while wearing them. His men could wear their German uniforms underneath and take off the American ones before opening fire. That, Skorzeny knew, was claptrap. Skorzeny also recognized that it would be impossible to create a cohesive brigade, which was the size unit he considered necessary, out of random volunteers in the short time available. Only with difficulty did he persuade Jodl to give him 2 infantry battalions and a company of tanks. Those were to be the core of the 150th Panzer Brigade of 3,300 men. The response to the call for volunteers who spoke American dialect left Skorzeny in dismay. Only 10, mostly former merchant seamen, spoke perfect English with some knowledge of American slang. Another 125 had a fair command of English, and about 200 others had learned a little English in school. A few could say yes and no. That was all. The quest for American uniforms and equipment was at least as discouraging. Although Skorzeny asked for 20 American tanks, he got 2, one of which quickly broke down with transmission trouble. Skorzeny had to make do with 12 Panthers camouflaged to look like Shermans, sufficient only, Skorzeny ruefully observed, to deceive very young American troops seeing them at night from very far away. Of 10 armoured cars received, 6 were British, but in any case they soon broke down. There were about 15 American trucks and 30 jeeps. The first consignment of uniforms turned out to be British. When a consignment of American field jackets arrived, they had a big triangle indicating prisoner of war painted on the back. There were a few American mortars and anti-tank guns, but no rounds for them, and possibly enough M1 rifles to arm half the brigade, but with limited amounts of ammunition. It was soon obvious that Skorzeny would be able to disguise only those men in a commando company who were to spread confusion in the American rear, and even those would lack much of the paraphernalia that American soldiers usually wore and carried. Skorzeny also had another security scare. Although his troops were sealed in their training area at Grafenwohr, near Nuremberg, so wild were the rumours circulating among them as to their mission that Skorzeny was sure some word would leak to Allied intelligence. Yet how to stop the rumours, Skorzeny decided at last to let them fly. The wilder the better. A few days later, when Skorzeny was visiting at Grafenwohr, a lieutenant assigned to the commando company asked to speak with him privately. "Sir," said the young officer, "I believe I know the real objective of the brigade." Skorzeny bristled. Had somebody talked? But the lieutenant quickly continued. "The brigade is to go straight to Paris and capture Allied headquarters." He himself wanted to help. He had lived in Paris and spoke French fluently. Although he recognized that Skorzeny had probably already drawn up a plan, he had some ideas he hoped Skorzeny would consider. After slipping through the lines in American uniforms, the men would rendezvous at the Café de la Paix on the Place de l'Opéra, and from there proceed to capture or assassinate General Eisenhower and his staff. As far as Skorzeny could make out, the lieutenant had based his reckoning on the codename Skorzeny had chosen for the operation, Greif. It meant a mythical bird, but in another sense the word could mean grasp. "Well," said Skorzeny, "go and think it all over very carefully and work out the details. We will have a further talk, but mind you, keep as silent as the grave." By the time night fell, Skorzeny reckoned, almost every man in the camp believed he knew what the mission was: kill Eisenhower. Aside from spreading confusion in the American rear, Skorzeny's mission was to seize 3 bridges over the Meuse in the zone of the 6th Panzer Army between Liège and the bend in the river at Namur. Once Volksgrenadier divisions had broken the American line, which Skorzeny assumed would be accomplished before the end of the first day, he was to send 3 task forces, 2 of which would have 12 tanks each through the darkness, bypassing opposition, and seize the bridges before the Americans could blow them. Jeeps carrying drivers and riders disguised as Americans were to lead the way. One of Skorzen's 3 task forces was to accompany another special group, a beefed-up Kampfgruppe of the 1st SS Panzer Division known as the Leibstandarte Adolf Hitler, a division which traced its origins to Hitler's first bodyguard, initially organized by Sepp Dietrich. The commander of the Kampfgruppe was SS Lieutenant Colonel Joachim Peiper, who at age 19 had become an officer candidate in the SS, and except for a brief stint on the staff of Reichsführer SS Himmler, had spent the next 10 years with the Leibstandarte Adolf Hitler and stood high in Hitler's personal favor. Possibly reflecting the SS distaste for names of biblical origin, Peiper had come to prefer to spell his first name, Jochen. The moment the Volksgrenadiers achieved a breakthrough, Kampfgruppe Peiper was to drive through the northern reaches of the Losheim Gap toward the bridge over the Meuse at Huy, midway between Liège and Namur. Over a route specially chosen because it had fewer bridges than the others at some points, Peiper was later to complain with considerable justification, a route more fit for bicycles than for tanks. Peiper was to dash for high without regard for his flanks, avoiding likely opposition, and where possible bypassing it if encountered. In the interest of speed, the armoured spearhead of Peiper's column could hardly be expected to burden itself with large numbers of prisoners of war, but whether they were to be cared for by troops following later in the column, or just what was to be done with them, would in time become a matter of major importance and tragedy. As each German soldier marched to his jump-off position in the Eifel, and on the evening of December 15th learned for the first time what he was to do, reactions varied widely. Some received the news stoically, much like Private First Class Stiegler, whose group was given a bottle of booze, and off we went. Others doubted that anything substantial could be accomplished. Had they not lived on promises ever since the retreat from Normandy? Where were the miracle weapons the official communiques promised? Many of those transferred from rear echelon posts and from the Navy and the Luftwaffe were depressed. At a time when the war was practically over, why should they have to fight and probably die for a lost cause? Thousands received the news with resignation. In the 2 DSS Panzer Division, for example, First Lieutenant Erich Heller and his young officer friends, all of whom had fought in Normandy, agreed that the war was virtually lost, but even so, they had no idea of not doing their duty. The people at home were taking terrible punishment from the bombers, yet they were holding firm, doing what was expected of them. As soldiers at the front, could they do less? For some, it was, in any case, a battle for survival, for if Germany lost the war, the people would be, at best, enslaved. If not, why the demand for unconditional surrender? Why the Morgenthau plan to abolish German industry and turn the country into a pastoral agricultural land? Still others saw the possibility of achieving something that might alleviate post-war Germany's fate. A sergeant in Kampfgruppe Peiper, Karl Wortmann, thought they would succeed, not necessarily a great victory, but gaining as much territory as possible to embarrass the Americans and demonstrate success to the German people. A regimental commander in the 12th Volksgrenadier Division, Karl Wilhelm Osterhold, intended to lead his troops as capably as possible, perhaps in the process achieving something that might lessen the harsh treatment that was in store for Germany. Thousands more received the news with enthusiasm. As one German officer wrote in his diary, "There is a general feeling of elation. Everybody is cheerful." PV Klaus Ritter and his young friends in the 18th Volksgrenadier Division were euphoric. In 4 weeks they would actually be in Paris. For many, faith in the Führer's ability to set matters right remained, and since all news came through a controlled press, they had no real knowledge of how grim was Germany's plight.